This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
Thank you all very much for being here tonight. Thanks to Cal Humanities for making this possible. The topic for tonight is vigilance within democracy, and the topic was inspired by the Jefferson quote about the price of what the price of freedom and liberty were vigilance. Jefferson also said, was reported to have said that in given the choice between government and newspapers, and doing without one or the other, he would have preferred to have newspapers than government. But then he got elected to office and he began to claim he had been misquoted. So from that sort of framework, Zocalo puts together, looks at big questions from a lot of different perspectives and different contexts. We have three very different people here from different parts of the country, different backgrounds, but they are all journalists in various formats, and they're all people who have looked at, while looking at a wide variety of topics. Among the topics that they've looked at are the media itself, and specifically questions about how we keep a check on power, we keep a check on government. And you're going to hear from all three of them. I'll introduce each of them as I ask them a question. Immediately to my right is Bernardo Ruiz. His most recent film, Reportero, which is an incredible film. If you haven't seen it, you must. It follows a veteran reporter named Sergio Haro, his colleagues at an embattled Mexican news weekly in Tijuana, Zeta, as they report on organized crime, corrupt local officials. The film's completed a 12-city tour of Mexico, screened at the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival, the Human Rights Watch Film Festival, and the LA Film Festival. It airs January 7th, correct? 2013 on the PBS documentary series POV. He's also currently serving as executive producer of two one-hour documentaries examining the nation's dropout crisis, and previously he was the director-producer of American Experience Roberto Clemente, which was the winner of the NCLR Alma Award for Outstanding Made for Television Documentary. He's done a number of other things. The question, though, for you I have is, what does vigilance mean at this time of transition of how we get information, decline of some institutions, including newspapers that did vigilance for us, that performed vigilance, the changes in how reporting is done? I mean, what does it mean? What should it mean in this context, and what does it mean in particular for the kinds of reporters that you have most recently made this film about, who are covering really difficult stories where there's real risk involved?
I think from my perspective as a documentary filmmaker, I don't know that I would consider myself a journalist in the traditional sense. I think I'm tasked with I have a slightly different set of challenges in front of me. Like a traditional journalist, I have to be factually accurate. But then that's really a point of departure to hopefully perform something that's some kind of artistry in theory. Mm-hmm. I certainly don't always get there. But for me, vigilance is also about depth. So I made Reportero about Seminario Zeta, about the staff of the reporters there, mainly Sergio Haro and Adela Navarro, who's the co-director of the paper. And I wanted to make the film because so much of the U.S. cable coverage that I was seeing about the drug war, especially in this part of the country, to me seemed woefully decontextualized. To me, it felt like rubbernecking body count journalism. X number of people shot up in the street on this day. This person was beheaded there, but no context, no background, no history, no deepening of this story. And so I'm by no means an expert in Mexico's drug war, but I did have a very strong interest in this region and in Tijuana. And so I began researching the project as early as 2007 while actually looking for another story. But in my case as a filmmaker, unlike many beat journalists who have to knock out a story quickly, who don't have the amount of time that you need often to tell these stories, I had, while I was in production, I had roughly a little over 2 years to spend with a story. That's enough time to really deepen your sense of a place, of an institution, to gain trust in sources, and to hopefully tell a deeper narrative. Whether or not I succeeded or failed in that task is up to the audience, and the people who kind of push back on my perspective. But for me, the ability to spend time with an issue, to deepen your understanding of that issue, hopefully provide that depth to audiences, to me that's key in trying to take apart that issue of vigilance.
I'm now going to talk about two different kinds of pressures, which are in no way similar, but speak to sort of how hard it is to be a professional reporter or documentary filmmaker in these times. I mean, in your film, you tell stories of, there are a couple of reporters, a columnist named Hector Feliz, a courts reporter at Zeta named Francisco Ortiz. We see die. We see the founder of Zeta, sort of shot, living on this side of the border to avoid danger. In a time where it's sort of so hard to sort of make a living doing this anywhere, are we asking too much of professional journalists, do you think,
It's a great question. I think what the newspaper reporters that I profile in Reportero, Sergio Ardo, the lead reporter that I profile himself, had very serious threats that actually forced him to send his family away for a while. But what they would say to me is, look, we're just regional reporters. We're doing our piece. We're covering organized crime as we see it play out in this region. But what are the U.S. reporters doing? So I was speaking to Carlos Dada, who basically started one of Latin America's first online news outlets. They're called El Faro, very fabulous online news outlet. He was saying it's almost as if David Copperfield were at the border when these SUVs packed with methamphetamines and other drugs and other illicit narcotics, as they're being funneled into the United States. It's as if they magically vanish when they hit the United States. Who's doing the reporting on the criminal distribution networks within the United States, in Atlanta, Dallas, Los Angeles, you name it? Who's doing that kind of reporting here? There's so much attention being focused on what's happening in Mexico, and we're lamenting the strengths or weaknesses of reporting within Mexico, but the Mexican reporters, especially the regional ones, were the ones being hardest hit. It's not the reporters in Mexico City or Guadalajara, it's the ones in these little regional outlets like Zeta, Tijuana. They really want to know who's telling the other side of the story. And even pulling back further, who's doing the money reporting? All of these narco dollars, where are they being banked? Who's doing the stories about money laundering? So I don't know if I answered your question,
No, you did.
but that's certainly a kind of a pushback there. Is who's telling the big story and the small story?
Let me bring Carrie Lozano into the conversation. She's a Bay Area-based documentary and filmmaker, journalist. Has done a lot of work, produced the Academy Award nominee The Weather Underground, which appeared at Sundance, produced and directed the Student Academy Award-winning film Reporter Zero, which was about Randy Schultz.
Mm-hmm.
We brought her for that, and also for, she's really an emerging expert in the question of sort of collaborative reporting journalists between news organizations, between citizens and news organizations. She works the investigative reporting program at UC Berkeley and has developed the program's collaborative reporting efforts, co-founder PBS Media Shifts Collaboration Central. Very basic question. We heard what Bernardo said about, who's doing this kind of reporting on the subject in the United States. I mean, for something like that, for anything, do existing American media have the resources, an individual paper, an individual television station, to do the kind of sophisticated reporting on the sort of the toughest stories to get at?
So if my boss was here, my boss is Lowell Bergman at UC Berkeley, and for any of you who've seen The Insider, he is the insider, Al Pacino. And what he says, I can't take credit for this quote, is that investigative reporting is not nonprofit, it's anti-profit. And it always has been, and he's right. I mean, really, nobody ever had the resources to spend 2 years on a story, to just sit a reporter. Nobody knows this, but the New York Times didn't even have an investigative unit until the 1990s, or maybe 1989, but I think it was somewhere in the 90s. And even then, it was just really a couple of people at that time. So on the one hand, yes, there's been a lot of hand-wringing, and I don't want to say that nothing's been lost, because I think especially, and Scott can talk about this, at the local level, a lot has been lost. The local watchdog, for sure is, I think, hurting around the country. At the national level, I don't know that it's so much the case that we're not able to be vigilant anymore. I just think that vigilance is taking a different form. It's taking form in more collaborative efforts where people are working together to produce really in-depth stories that are hard-hitting, that do help take that watchdog role. And also, it's happening in other mediums. So a lot of documentary filmmaking is becoming increasingly investigative, and there's becoming much more support and acknowledgement for that. So it's, if you look at the numbers over time, yes, more newspapers don't exist. A lot of reporters have lost their jobs, in fact, and that's true. You can't deny it. But I went to the investigative reporting conference this year, and there were 1,500 people there, and it was one of the largest turnouts ever. So people are still doing the work. They're doing it in different ways. The money has always been hard to come by. It may be, in fact, harder, but we also have wider means of distribution. So it's hard to say what, there's no clear cost-benefit analysis of was it better then than it is now. I'm not 100% convinced. I just think it's different now.
Okay, now I worked in 3 newsrooms, that of the Baltimore Sun, the Wall Street Journal, and the LA Times. And, when I hear talk about collaborative reporting, I mean, I've worked with many brilliant people, but playing well with others was not a strength of the people I worked with across any of those things. They were very, very difficult folks. Yeah. They had a hard time collaborating and getting along with the person, sitting next to them in the newsroom in the same place. My old boss from the LA Times, Dean Baquet, this symposium you were at earlier, this year, called the whole collaborative, dismissed it, said it's a pain in the A. Right. Tell me what one of these things looks like. You've actually watched them and been embedded in them. Right. Explain what happens and how do they get along, or do they get along?
So, for those of you who haven't worked in a newsroom before, journalists and news organizations are incredibly competitive, and oftentimes, even today, there's in your contract, you're signing confidentiality agreements. You won't talk about your story. And there's a story that at the Washington Post, I don't know if this is true, I haven't been able to confirm it, that they used to assign reporters the same story. They'd assign the same story to 2 reporters just to get that competitive edge, see who does a better job. So there's a huge cultural issue here. What's happening now, though, because of diminished resources, is that news organizations are, in fact, starting to say, oh, I can't do that type of work on my own. I'm going to start to work with other technically competing news organizations. So I've been involved mostly in large-scale collaborations that involved PBS Frontline, that involve ProPublica, which is a nonprofit. Right now, we're doing something with Univision and the Center for Investigative Reporting. This is all, it might seem like a no-brainer. I mean, it kind of is, especially today, but it's true that culturally, it's just completely out of the norm. So we received at UC Berkeley a Knight grant a couple of years ago, and what the Knight Foundation asked us to do was to kind of do a how-to model for how to do collaborative reporting. And what we quickly realized is that, before we can teach people how to do this, we need to change their minds about it. Like, we need to, change the culture in some ways, or at least to start to talk about the culture. So do they always play well with others? No, not always. And it can be really difficult. So my big thing, the thing that I say at every conference, is that I think in the news industry, we need to do put a lot more effort into teaching teamwork in the way that other businesses do, and into teaching leadership. Because with good leadership and good teamwork skills and acknowledgement of that, actually, reporters can do a job that they feel good about, working together.
Are these collaborations because of money? Because there's not enough money, so everyone needs to get their money together, or the audience is too fractured? Is it just basically money and audience?
It's both. I
Yeah.
mean, it's both. For Frontline, the executive producers there just felt like they don't have investigative reporters on staff. They can't do it. They can't afford it. They want to have the most cutting-edge investigative stories on the air. The way they do that is to work with other organizations who are doing investigative work. They're not broadcast organizations necessarily. They're investigative reporters. So it's about the money, and it's also about the fractured audience. And one thing that we realized when we worked on a series with ProPublica, Frontline, and NPR was that when you have an NPR story with 25 million listeners, more people are going to watch the broadcast. So it's kind of finding ways to capitalize on different audiences and on different skill sets.
Great. Thank you very much. Let's bring in Scott Lewis, who's the CEO of the Voice of San Diego. I think recognizable to many people here. He manages the internal operations and the strategic vision for the organization. Has created partnerships and projects. He's gotten a lot of attention. He's a regular on TV and radio, hosts the weekly segments San Diego Fact Check and San Diego Explained on NBC7 here, and his columns run in San Diego Magazine. He's got a weekly radio show in Kogo, et cetera, et cetera. So you're one of these serial collaborators, yeah. To use an old word in a different context. But you've got a staff. This Voice of San Diego, for all its attention, has 10 people, right? Yeah. So what kind of vigilance void can you fill, with partnerships and your young, hungry, talented staff? And what can't you do?
Well, one of the things I would love to do is actually map what we're not doing, the areas, the geographies, the institutions that aren't being covered and watched. I mean, there is just a function of holding a mirror up to somebody and they fix their hair, right? And so there is just by showing people that you're watching, there's a positive effect. Our goal is to cover things, to use our resources as best we can, which means that we absolutely cannot repeat or be redundant to anybody else's work, which means that, Jeff Jarvis has that quote, you do what you do best and you link to the rest. What we do best is find narratives, find investigations, find stories that we can really be the best at and that we can frame and that we can explain. And then let other people do what they do best and accentuate that and try to help that. So when we look at partnerships, we're looking at a world where the producers of content, the drivers of explanation and storytelling don't have to be tied to the means of distribution, a broadcast or a printing press or whatever. The idea that you should have the means of production and distribution within the same operation that comes up with the storytelling, I think is an old one just based on the newspaper having a printing press in its building. And so, we've decided that we can be this agency that supports public radio, that supports commercial radio, that supports magazines and TV, and that we can all work together to try to tell the best stories possible. We're switching also to not necessarily think of what our reporters do as cover beats, but to cover narratives instead. The human mind learns and thinks in narratives. And so rather than just putting one person on education to try to gobble that entire fire hose that comes at him, to put somebody and have them come up with the narratives that they're going to follow. They can add new narratives, they can subtract them, but really try to explain them and make sure that people are enrolled, because if they're not enrolled in those narratives, then something will play out without their impact, and that's the point of it.
Just a follow-up question. I'm not thinking of any city in particular here, but for example, with that kind of operation, let's say you had that kind of operation in a city where the daily newspaper in town started to do some very strange things.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. Was owned by somebody who was very openly talking they were going to, support particular causes, particular developments, particular parties. Just imagine that something like that could happen.
I'll try.
Does that add to the obligation of citizens, of people like you, to do more to fill that void, or can you fill the void of a newspaper? Is that city just out of luck if its newspaper goes off the rails?
I think a couple of things. First of all, it's a remarkable symbol of what's happening to journalism. Locally, the owners of the Union Tribune just purchased the North County Times for less than the owner of the UT sold his house for. The assets are just completely collapsing in value. They bought the North County Times for $12 million. He had sold his house for 18. It's an expensive house, so setting aside that, these properties can be acquired and done with as you may. But this is not an expensive problem to fix. And I think that's an important thing to remember. I run on a budget of a little more than $1 million. That's a lot to a person like me, but to a cultural institution with impact for the entire city, it's really not that much. We're in a museum that runs on a much higher budget. Theater companies, ballet companies, university colleges within universities, even just professors within universities often run on bigger budgets. Point being that if we wanted to solve this and if we realized that we wanted to have far more coverage, there are ways to do that, and we have set up a society that knows how to fund institutions with that type of impact. The Texas Tribune is our we inspired the creation of the Texas Tribune. Now they inspire us with their ideas and their structure.
And they were created by people from the Texas Monthly magazine who wanted to focus on state politics in Texas, essentially.
Yeah, we were featured on the front page of the New York Times after some investigations that we did, and then they called us that day and said, "Well, how do you do that? What are you going to do? What can we do here?" And they decided they wanted to do an entity in Austin that covered politics that would be relevant to the entire state. And now they're running at a $3 or $4 or $5 million budget. I believe it's about $4 million. And we're all, gawking at that. But that's really not that much money for the type of impact an institution like that can have. With a combination of events, with corporate and member sponsors, you can do some pretty impressive things. And so, we are trying to look at this as a problem to solve. Don't cover anything unless we can do it better than anyone else or no one else is doing it. And make sense of what people say, fact check it and that sort of thing, but then find out what they don't want to say as well. And so applying those types of metrics to the stories and narratives that you're going to cover can make it so that you're leveraging a small amount of resources a lot better than perhaps the old models did.
For the whole panel, so you mentioned, Bernardo, specifically a story here, big story here that's getting missed. What are we missing when we sort of, we do the things we can with the resources we can? What are the holes that are opening up where we're not being vigilant, do you think? What are the areas that we...
Well, I think there's geographic and there's qualitative. There's areas that you're not covering. There's institutions that simply are going about their business. One of the problems that we face, though, is that people appreciate investigative journalism when it's done, when it has its impact. But when it's not around, you don't know what you're missing necessarily. You don't, and so, we don't know what we don't know. And I think that's an important quote for all of us.
Right. We look for stories really where work really literally is not being done. So one of the big stories we've done, a series of stories in the last year, was about death investigation in America. So you may read about a murder investigation in your town or in the nearby city, and it might seem kind of flawed and weird, but then that's kind of the end of it. And so this came from a long trail of reporting done by many different people, but we started to just get a sense that we didn't have a sense of what the country looked like. But what does death investigation mean? We started to learn that there were no rules for what it meant to be a coroner. You didn't have to be a doctor or trained in some cities. In one city, there's an anecdote that somebody was also the janitor as well as the coroner. So we actually are looking for tips where there's a story in front of you, the local, flawed murder investigation, but what's behind that? And that's kind of what we're always doing, is trying to look at an issue that may be all around us, but that no one's kind of found a really particular angle. And we're lucky because we have the capacity to do national stories and to try to get different organizations involved to look at something on a national scale.
I think just to piggyback on that, as a documentary filmmaker and as an independent, I have a small company, but we're 4 people. But really, it's that at that moment when you commit to a story, you better know that you're gonna do a good job, or that once you go down that rabbit hole, we're talking about a couple of years. But I think for me, the criteria is always, can I even take a narrative that's out there and that's well known, I kind of find a back door into that story. I always think about that Jimmy Breslin story about when I don't know if it's a
legendary
popular-
columnist in New York, for those who don't know that.
Exactly, who when Kennedy was being buried, was looking for an angle and a way to tell the story, and ended up doing this beautiful piece interviewing the gravedigger. So kind of telling the whole story of Kennedy's death, but through the point of view of this gravedigger. And I always think, okay, well, I mean, it was a little bit what I did with Reportero, is how do you talk about the drug war? How do you talk about U.S. links to that drug war? How do you talk about this thing that's so impossible? Well, you know, you have to root it in some specific story, and then also find some kind of backdoor, some different way into it. So I think for me, that's always an important piece of the puzzle.
Just to look at another aspect of this, you hear a lot about citizens doing journalistic things, witnessing with their cameras all over the world. And I found myself thinking as I was watching Reportero about, you know, everyone from, you know, folks in Syria, you know, in homes trying to sort of show what they could, to, you know, folks here in Oakland with camera phones trying to sort of show police, you know, misbehaving. You know, someone who, you know, clearly in this wrestled a lot with the question of the acts of journalism, how to protect people, whether they're citizens or professionals committing acts of journalism. What do you think? I mean, we don't really have a big conversation about that. We sometimes talk about a federal shield law. Should there be an international standard of, you know, journalistic rights where, you know, if you're committing journalism, you should be protected in some way? How do you protect those folks?
Well, good luck implementing that law. That would be the first thing. But I think that's, I mean, it's a great question. It's something that the journalists in Tijuana struggle with all the time, with the rise of social media and even sites that I'm sure many of you have heard about, sites like El Blog del Narco, which started off as this compendium of information about basically narco turf wars, shootings in streets, beheadings, etc. It started off almost like a kind of visual wallpaper of violence. It has since become, interestingly, has become more sophisticated and is beginning to write articles and put, the editor is of course anonymous, but they're beginning to publish pieces. So this thing that was touted early on as being this kind of, this innovative or this new information delivery system is now morphing into a more traditional journalistic entity. But what the journalists at SETA and would say is that that's great that information is there. And yes, the kind of iPhone video or the man on the street, so-called man on the street video of an event can be uploaded quickly, but who's providing context and analysis? And it's not that we need to always rely on experts, but if you're writing for a weekly, like at SETA, that really gives you a totally different approach. You can provide context, you can provide perspective in a way that you don't necessarily get from that immediate delivery of information, of data.
What about the two of you are both doing collaborative work? To what extent are you using stuff that comes in from citizens? To what extent are you putting data and maps and other things out that citizens can then put the pieces together sometimes where you can't? How much of that do you do? What's its value and what doesn't work about it?
Well, we haven't found a magic formula. We don't have the type of investment you can make in some of the tools, the data tools that other people do. I think it's important to remember journalists have always used the crowd they put out a story knowing full well that the responses are probably more valuable than the story that they put out in order to see what the truth is. I think that we're just entering a really exciting phase. You mentioned context. With this disruption, there's been a lot of different efforts to do the same role that journalists do. Not just do classified job ads better, but also to maybe organize information a little bit better. And one of the roles that I think journalists never quite picked up the way that they should have, and that we're trying to explore more and more, is their educational role. So you can do investigative journalism, but the idea that people understand everything journalists talk about or write about in their stories each day is really something we need to examine, because they're not following these stories very well. And it's not their fault. The stories aren't being told very fully. They're not being brought up to speed. I think that the number of people who know how school board elections work, or how different aspects of our community actually function before they can even get enrolled in the story about how they're developing is something that journalists need to take stock in and step back from. And there's formulas being applied to how we're telling stories, things like fact checks and explains and reader's guides and stuff like that help people enroll in those stories a little easier.
Yeah, to the collaboration citizen question. Yeah.
We are not an outlet. We're a program at the University of California at Berkeley. It's a graduate program that does real reporting, but we're working with different organizations. So we don't really have an initiative per se. But what I will say is that there are organizations that are doing incredible work with citizens. The Guardian UK, to me, is the best example of a large news organization that works with citizens on a huge scale. One of the things they did in the last couple of years was to pull some public records about the way that their politicians were spending money, millions and millions of documents, and they created kind of a form, and citizens volunteered to go through those millions of documents, and they kind of competed, and it was amazingly successful. I don't know how many thousands of people participated, but it was a lot. And The Guardian is very innovative and probably less squeamish than American journalists at trying to find ways to engage citizens. I will say for us, we don't get a lot of cold calls or tips, but we never ignore, I don't know if there's journalists or aspiring journalists out there, we never ignore a tip. I don't care how crazy it seems, how nonsensical it seems, how far-fetched about aliens, we always follow up on every single tip. And you will be surprised at how many amazing stories actually we get out of those tips. Or having a conversation on an airplane. So on that way, we definitely deal with people in a real serious way. And when we do large-scale investigations, one of the things that we try to do is to make information available for other reporters. So with the death investigation, we created maps that showed in each, I think, county or state level, I think it's different at the county level, how investigations worked, what journalists could do to report in their communities, and trying to share as much information as we can so that other reporters can take what we've done and then carry it forward.
It's something both of you said, and particularly when Scott started talking about educational, I couldn't help but thinking of the Internal Revenue Service when you started talking about educational. You've got a nonprofit organization. You're collaborating with nonprofits. Is Bernardo Ruiz Productions a for-profit or non?
Well, it's not a nonprofit, but I've never made a profit as a documentary filmmaker.
Fair enough.
And I'm funded primarily by public funders, and foundations.
So your nonprofit, you've got money from foundations, which all say you don't have to. They can be a little fickle. They can be, they've got agendas. Problem one. Second problem is the IRS seems to not buy, in many cases, they're not buying yet the notion that nonprofit journalistic enterprises are educational things. How do you wrestle with, both of those?
There's a discomfort in the prior generation with the idea that newspapers aren't going to be okay. And so the idea that it needs to be a public service type entity that takes that role is still something they're getting accustomed to. There is movement in a positive direction.
These are older IRS agents who are holding back.
I don't know I didn't say that. My point being, though, what I'm kind of trying to address is that there is a role as journalists of education. There is a gap between when you leave school, even college, and civic engagement and being able to maybe run for office.
Yeah.
So what that knowledge is, how do you learn all of the things about how your community works? There is a gap, and we have no organized system for how to get you to that point other than for you to individually, get upset about your son's school or a stop sign that's not in place or something like that, and then you start getting engaged. I don't think it should be that serendipitous, and so that's why I think that our type of organizations can embrace that educational role and do more of it while we're doing investigative and vigilance.
To the specific question, have you had a hard time getting 501c3?
No, we were one of the first, so maybe they started to dial back when there were more controversial organizations applying. It's gone quite well. We've never had trouble with it, and it's important to note that the members, people who want to support us, it's not a question in their mind when they make that decision. Everyone's wondering, would people support journalism organizations. And all these newspapers fall apart, and they say, well, people aren't willing to pay for journalism. Well, have you asked? Like, so few of them have asked. The Rocky Mountain News fell apart without ever once pleading with its community to support it. And,
Really?
and
They just closed it down? They never asked, please help us subscribe?
they never said anything about
become a
raising
member?
rates,
Yeah.
and it just stopped. And there's this website just stood there like a depressing time capsule for months. And it drove me nuts because these entities are falling apart without ever actually wondering what their community would support. And frankly, a nonprofit is in much better situation to actually make that plea to the community, because a for-profit, these are set up for shareholder values, where actually receiving money as gifts is kind of awkward, although we're seeing it in different newsrooms around the country.
So you're saying you're a more sympathetic face for a public plea than Doug Manchester?
I'm saying that that a mission-based organization
Yeah.
is a more sympathetic organization to support with your dollars.
Carrie, when you've reported on some of these collaborations that are foundation funded or funded, have you seen examples of the funder trying to meddle?
Yes, but it's a meddling in a really particular way, which is that there are very few foundations that exist solely to support journalism. There are few, but there aren't many. There are actually thousands of foundations in this country, and they have very specific desires and goals and impacts in mind. So it might be to better their community, it might be to better the arts, it might be, there's any hosts of things. So when I say meddling, it's that sometimes they will give a news organization money with a very specific scope in mind. Maybe, and I'm making this up to be fair, maybe they want you to just cover education. Well, that could be great, but maybe what you really need to cover is something else in that community, but suddenly you have a check in front of you and you feel compelled to cover education. So that's the type of thing that we're seeing here and there, but that overall is kind of concerning. I think that it could be that foundations could be kind of educated about journalism. I went to a big foundation conference and realized that they don't necessarily understand the ethos of journalism, and that goes against the ethos of journalism to tell a media organization what they should cover. So I think if we have a little more communication, it could change, but it'll take some time and effort.
Yeah, in scouting around for money to make films, how tough is it out there? Is there money for Vigilance?
I mean, on the documentary side, it's most of the time as documentarians where it's what would be considered enterprise journalism. So we subsidize our own development processes, and then by the time we have something to show or a sense of a pitch, we're going to foundations. So typically it's a different process in that we're going to places where we think these projects will be well received. I'm also sometimes commissioned by entities. I'm currently working on an education series, and that's a commission from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So the mandate is very clear. I've been very lucky in that the foundations that have supported my work, and in this in Reportero, we had quite a bit of support from the Ford Foundation. There was zero editorial meddling, and certainly no restrictions on what we should and shouldn't be talking about.
Another aspect of this discussion of vigilance and where it can come from, as the standing army of journalists has declined and been given their honorable or not so honorable discharges, particularly in the last decade, they've gone into all kinds of institutions, and I keep finding old colleagues or people I knew who are doing journalism from within different kinds of places or journalistic things, or will tell me that at least. I wonder start with government as one. You started in government, right? You were in the Inspector General at HHS, at Health and Human Services. And, the legislative leadership in California hired a bunch of journalists out of the press corps, put them in office, and they occasionally put out stories which have not gotten a lot of attention. But there are reporters working in LA County where I live for one of the Board of Supervisors. They do sort of journalistic blogs. They're sometimes even critical internally. Does that have value? Is that can the government be doing this? Can you be doing journalism from within government? Is that where part of vigilance comes from?
No. I mean, I don't think you can. I don't think you can be doing journalism from within government. I mean, the Office of Inspector General is supposed to be, and this is at the federal level, is supposed to be apolitical. I mean, that wasn't the case, to be totally frank. And it's been a long time since I worked there. I don't know what it's like now, but when I was there during the Clinton administration, it was absolutely not apolitical. People make decisions about what course you're going to take, what they're going to fund, what you're going to do. I was told that during the Bush administration, the OIG would write reports that would be completely redlined and would turn into, a one-page memo if it didn't fall along certain lines. So I don't think that that's possible.
Let me disagree a little bit. There's maybe not vigilance, but there is with resources in our world dwindling, all these complaints about not covering good news or different types of news that come from different types of entities, I think can be reapportioned to other needs. Look at locally, the mayor's office had at one point 3 of some of the best former writers in town as far as journalists.
This is Mayor Jerry Sanders here in San Diego.
And they could have produced a voice of the mayor's office that was quite interesting to read, that I would have read quite well. Now, is that government propaganda? Is that his propaganda? Of course it is. But on the other hand, look at what the NFL.com is doing. It runs columns, analysis, rather interesting, even conflict-type stories. And it's because it's a source going direct. These sources are going direct with their stories. And in a world of dwindling resources, that actually frees those resources to be used for hypervigilance and for make sense of what they're saying, fact check it, change it, put it into context, and then find out things that they don't want to say. But perhaps we can drop the complaint that we're not covering good news and let them cover their own good news.
That's a good point.
That's interesting. What about sort of the NGO as a place? I mean, Human Rights Watch has won some journalistic awards for its work. In the Los Angeles area, one of the best investigative reporters I worked with, the LA Times, Ted Rorlick, now sort of does investigative reporting, but he's paid for by the largest Service Employees International Union local. I mean, what about that sort of thing? I mean, if taken with a grain of salt, is that part of
In a world where Doug Manchester can buy a newspaper for $12 million, we're pretty close to where everyone's just going to be open about what these newspapers are trying to do. And so if a non-governmental organization is open about what it's trying to do and produces a product where it's transparent about its funding and other things like that, we might have to live in a world where you look through a menu of options like that and trust people to put it together into a narrative you can understand.
What do you think? What do you think of this?
I was just going to say that I think as long as these projects are explicit about where their support is coming from, that they're upfront about it, then I think that at least you have a fighting chance. And interestingly, a lot of the commercial organizations aren't explicit or honest about where their support is coming from. So I think in some ways we're holding the NGOs and the nonprofits to a higher degree of scrutiny than we are the commercial world.
We're switching from a world where you get credibility from the institution you're part of to where you get credibility based on the algorithm that you're using to find your information and how transparent you are. And so it used to be that a young, even fabulous like Jason Blair could go work for the New York Times and he would have credibility because he worked for the New York Times. And I think we're switching to a world where an organization has to just be open, show how it goes about its business, what its point is, what it's trying to do, and then let the reader take with it what you may.
What about the academy? What about universities as a home for this? And I should, full disclosure, one of Zocalo's most important partners is Arizona State University. They help us fund our digital humanities journalism, published every day. You work within the academy where you're also doing investigative journalism. Is that a natural home with academic freedom, or does that have drawbacks and problems that maybe aren't immediately apparent?
I'm sure it does, and I think it just depends on the institution. There is an idea kind of out in the journalism world that we can all become like teaching hospitals, right? That universities can become sort of teaching schools for journalism and put real information out into the world. And I think it depends each year for us. I mean, some years we have an amazing group of students who are very engaged, and as with anything, you might get a year where that's not the case. And so I think there's ups and downs, but I think there are more pros than cons, at least for us. Being at an academic institution also has like tremendous benefits, just basic ones. Insurance, now our building is paid for, so we don't pay rent anymore. The university pays the rent. There are many, many benefits to it, but it's definitely a different way of working. And it involves a lot of time and mentorship beyond the actual reporting, and a different type of fundraising too.
Have either of you collaborated with the universities in any of your work?
I haven't had much success with it yet. That doesn't mean I couldn't figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've never done that. No.
There is a project we worked on, one of our bigger investigations we worked on with Claremont and McKenna about food stamp and social welfare services distribution in San Diego County, and how much less it was in comparison to other counties in California in particular. And they helped us create the data for that. So there are ways through specific projects.
I read a lot more about that. A partner of Zocalo in the past, actually, the Lane Center at Stanford has this sort of partnership with a media lab at Stanford and something called the Spatial History Lab, and there's all this. It seems to allow the journalists to do more with data, more sort of deeper kind of dive data mining, and the journalist is almost the translator of what comes out of the data. Is that sort of the great potential of that? They got big computers and.
A partnership always works best when both partners realize they can't do something. Mm-hmm. And so if a journalist realizes they have a problem they could solve if only they had a camera or a data cruncher or a map, geography whiz or something, then they can do anything. But it's very important that both partners realize they can't do what the other partner can do.
I wonder sometimes if journalists have always been sort of conveners in some sense. They translate, they go find people to translate experts. But if we're minting fewer journalists, do we get in the army? The army is putting fewer through the boot camp of making cops calls on a night desk. Do you get to the point where you have to sort of train experts and people in different realms of the profession and how to be journalism? That's the next thing. The journalists won't be the troops. It'll be like sort of early Vietnam. We'll be the folks who come in to train the citizen or the expert. Essentially, we're on a training mission.
I actually think the really exciting front will be a version of that where the forensic accountants become journalists, the prosecutors become journalists, the military experts become journalists. I think that this idea that journalism school just produces journalism is probably, there's a role for storytelling as a profession, but I'm really excited to see like some statisticians have become expert in polling and in finance writing and stuff like that, and I'm really excited to see that translate to the local level. And if we could ever afford some real accountants to investigate the city's books and stuff like that, some who also knew how to write, I mean, that would be an expensive person.
That's the key part, though. I'm not worried about CPAs being good storytellers. I mean, I love I think that's a really exciting idea to have these hyper-specialized folks in that space. But one of the things that allows me to sleep at night is that, when you spend a lifetime, for good or for bad, working on being a storyteller, I may not be an expert, but I'm smart enough to know where I don't know something, and I can talk to somebody and double down in that particular field. And I think something like Planet Money is such a great example. It's an hour of riveting radio about these hard economic concepts, and they do precisely what you've been talking about, this education piece, where you take something that's incredibly complex and you boil it down into a way that makes sense to a viewer, but it's all told through narrative, through the kind of power of narrative. And I feel like I'm not an expert and woefully uneducated about vast pieces of American life, but as a storyteller, I understand I need to go here and there to put those pieces together.
Is there, I wanted to follow up on something you referenced, which is the notion of the the journalism school as a teaching hospital. You're seeing more journalism schools asked to do more than that. There was a bunch of foundations got together fairly recently and wrote a letter. I'll use a verb that you're not supposed to use in writing old newspaper leads. Slammed really journalism schools around the country for not moving towards that model, and suggested they weren't. I mean, what are journalism schools producing? And I part of me wonders if there isn't is that is part of what's going on? I mean, this is again a cynical journalist question. Is part of what's going on? We're trying to keep labor costs low. We're looking for not. I mean, that's a perfect model, right? Those are people not only don't have to pay, but they're paying you for the privilege of doing the work, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
The thing, and this is completely my opinion, is that I think that the world is changing so much faster than academia is accustomed to. Journalism, I mean, even just a few years ago, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We'd be having the death of the newspaper conversation, which we had for like 5 or 6 years. We all went to those panels. And I feel like things change so quickly. The technology has changed things so rapidly that I think academia has a very hard time keeping up and knowing what to tell young journalists who are coming to the school what they should do. A year ago, it was they should do everything. This year, I'm reading a slew of articles saying, no, I want specialists again. Well, so I think that's partly what's happening is the world is moving at such a rapid pace.
We also have this switch, though, with such a robust media industry for so long, the goal of academia, as it applied to media, was to protect quality, to enforce quality, to change, and to talk about best practices. With the death of the media industry, and I mean, it is a death. It's the graphs are just shocking. The role has to switch to innovation, to figuring out how to protect those values, the vigilance and other things that we care about. And so that itself has to have some element of innovation and creativity. It can't just be about best practices, these great stories we wrote, that sort of thing.
If you want to become a documentary filmmaker, where do you learn how to do that? Where do you go train? Where you just pick up your camera? I mean, what advice do you give to someone who says, I want to be like Bernardo Ruiz. I want to have I want to do a film like Reportero.
Those Scared Straight documentaries, where an ex-con goes and talks to a kid who's just gotten into trouble. I sometimes feel like I go into documentary programs and I give that lecture, like, do you really want to do this? Do you know what this is going to lead to? I think, I actually teach in the School of Visual Arts' newly created MFA program. They have a social documentary program. It's a 2-year program.
That's in New York.
In New York,
yeah.
And, I think there are really two routes. I mean, one is the route that I took, which is like running away to join the circus. It's like being a minor league ball player. You basically, you train at the feet of people who are really good at what they do. And
Who trained you?
I was lucky enough to work for a couple of really great filmmakers. I worked for Orlando Bagwell for a few years on a series called Matters of Race, which was a PBS series. And Orlando had come out of the Eyes on the Prize series, looking at civil rights history in America. That was a kind of a fundamental place for me to learn. I also worked on the documentary series POV for a long time. But I learned by working in production and then by immediately working on things of my own. But I do think there is a benefit to that best practices thing that happens in an institution where you're not just struggling to make the thing. You're actually talking about it, and you also have community and resources. So I think if you can afford it, I think that is certainly a powerful route. I just happen to have learned the hardest way possible, which is just by working in production and not doing anything else.
Is that an issue here that the kind of the methods, the institutions and the sort of patterns of career that allowed people to be trained to do sort of watchdogs type stuff, whether they were exactly journalists or, did similar things, are those drying up? I mean,
documentary film is interesting because in some ways I think that still really exists. That apprenticeship model is really part of how you become a filmmaker. But I think in journalism, the apprenticeship model that the newspapers used to offer is definitely going away. And you have a staff of 10, and you might be able to mentor some number, but it used to be the copy boy or girl, and you really could rise through the ranks. So I think we are in a different place, but at the same time, I don't want to put a quality judgment on that because everything's different.
But it's also, the disruption's also freeing up possibilities for other people to arise
Right,
that wouldn't
exactly.
have in the old system. And I
Exactly.
It
think
was a
that,
very closed system. Where are your
Absolutely.
clips? Where's your summer internship?
Yeah.
All that
Right.
sort of
and it was a
Right.
very defined path. I was actually in the path and then watched it explode. and so that was, it's jarring and it's difficult. So, but I also think it offers some opportunities for people who are building their brand and credibility to rise through.
Here's a question. I mean, I think one thing that seems to change as it gets very diverse, and the last question before we go to the audience for questions, but, it used to be, when there weren't as many institutions, when it wasn't this bigger, more diverse, kind of crazy array of things where, people sort of wonder who's a journalist anymore and what's that. It seemed like there was a stronger, commonly, publicly known ethic of what a journalist was supposed to be and how to behave. And it doesn't seem to me that there's been any, we're sort of without an ethic.
Well,
So, I mean, should there be basic sort of training for the citizen to know what a journalist is how they could do very basic journalistic things? I mean,
Remember we talked about education. Journalists always knew this, and they always talk about all these rules and ethics and stuff like that. But the broader public, they never took the time to actually narrate that, to enroll the public in their own narrative. Everyone in a newspaper knew that the editorials were separate from the newspaper, but there's nothing very stark in the actual paper explaining that, like every day. And we just assume that we do a story 3 months ago, we assume they read it. This is just a problem in our industry, and one thing that these new entities have to do is enroll people in the high standards that they have, talk about constantly why they should be trusted, that sort of thing, but it's a constant enrollment.
Right. I do want to say, though, that one thing that I do feel like has been lost is that while there's more room for new voices and more innovative voices, by the time the newspapers collapsed, most of them had made a really strong commitment to diversity. And that still exists in some of those newsrooms. And as you're seeing these new nonprofits come up, for reasons that are just mere survival, they're not there at that point. So we are losing, actually,
Absolutely.
a lot of diversity in our journalism. And so that's one real big red flag that I feel very strongly about in figuring out how to support all these nonprofits in those goals.
When a newspaper was an institution that you could complain to
Right.
change its practices, that was the way to solve the problems in some ways. And now with the institution falling apart, you have to solve those problems yourself.
You're right. And some people do it and have made real commitments, and some organizations don't for a wide variety of reasons.
please join me in thanking everyone for being here tonight and thanking the panel. And we'll see you at the reception.